Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me to keynote here. So what I want to talk about is strategies for think tanks in a shifting geopolitical landscape. What I'll be doing is sharing how we have approached it from our think tank in these interesting times. Our think tank occupies a sort of unique position in the think tank landscape. We're an African think tank that is based in Berlin, Germany. If you're wondering why there's an African think tank in Berlin, just wait till after this. If you're still wondering, you can ask questions. What I'll be doing is speaking a lot from an African Europe perspective. But for those who are not working on either of these regions or who are not from these regions, I'll try and have at the conclusion something that we can all take away. So again, I'll try and be provocative just to keep you awake. So a little bit about APRI. We are an African think tank in Europe. While we're an African think tank, we're also a European think tank. We are registered in Germany. We are legally, statutorily obligated to fulfill all the obligations that a think tank in Germany would have to fulfill. Our core mandate is to contribute to policy-making processes in Germany and at the EU level that concern the African continent. In this regard, we see ourselves as sort of an embassy of African intellectuals, African think tankers at the heart of Europe. So if you're an African think tank. When we started out, our strategy and niche was providing input to policy-making processes in Germany and in Europe with an understanding of the European political and policy landscape. Right? Our first preoccupation was in getting the African part of that equation right, because part of the reason that we were founded was because we saw a lack of African knowledge in Berlin, in Germany, African knowledge of the quality that we thought should be present in the landscape, and also in some ways on the European level as well. So in order to sort of address this, we focused on putting together a team of African researchers and experts to help understand and sometimes also define African positions on what we consider to be the key global public policy issues of our time. So I'm talking about things like climate change, climate action. I'm talking about digital policies, which became a lot more present in our lives with the coronavirus and pandemic. I'm talking about trade policy, about geopolitics, and so on. Delivering on that mandate involved having teams of researchers on the ground in a few African countries to try and understand issues from the perspectives of the societies, but also of the policymakers in those countries. So we currently have teams of researchers working on locally led adaptation in Ghana, Senegal, and Nigeria. We have a trade policy officer who's based on the continent looking at the African Continental Free Trade Area. We have someone also working on energy and climate policy on the continent as well. And I'll zone in a little bit on one example of a case that we worked on and still continue to work on, and that's climate finance. So for anyone who knows a bit about climate finance, we hear a lot about how much global north countries and rich countries pledged and didn't deliver. So we hear the story a lot from that perspective of those who didn't deliver it, and we don't often hear the perspective of those who should have received it. So in other words, what are the plans that African governments have on the books that we don't get to hear about when we focus a lot on what should have come in but it didn't come in? So for that, we had people work in Ghana, in Zambia, and also in South Africa to just look at what's on the books of countries, what plans do they have, what flows are coming in, how do the flows match with the plans that they have, what's the state of implementation, why they're not being implemented, and so on. And with that, we had a report that we've been engaging with German policymakers with, and we will continue to engage with them based on the report. So this part of our mandate, the part where we try to understand African positions on key policy issues, involved building partnerships. We heard yesterday a lot about partnerships and networks with African think tanks, African universities, to sort of combine efforts in this endeavor of getting African positions and perspectives to policymakers in Europe. And we've been sort of also bringing their insights, things they've worked on before. We are also trying to sort of, highlight them as well. But a little over a year ago, things sort of started getting a bit different for us. We started taking the other part of the equation, which is sort of looking at the European policymaking processes very seriously, right? And of course, you know what happened just a little over a year ago. So as the work of foreign policy think tanks, and I put in that category think tanks that work on development, international development as well. Our work is often influenced by the political climate, by the geopolitics of the moment. It meant that we had to sort of start thinking very clearly about what do these moments, what does it mean for African countries in general? But also, what does it mean for Europe as well? Because I think that's a question that we don't often pose from the other side, and I'm going to talk a bit about that in the course of this keynote. So the new geopolitical landscape sort of revealed certain European vulnerabilities. The obvious one is military, but we will not talk about that. But one that surprised me, and that I think surprised a few people as well, is the fact that Europe still depends so much on fossil fuels. I mean, Europe has been talking about fossil fuel and living it for such a long time, but just seeing how much of Europe's energy is still from fossil fuel was surprising. And we still depend on fossil fuel. I mean, we just switched to Russia for the US and for Norway. And then also seeing how much Europe depends on a country that is described as a competitor, strategic adversary, for the goods that will power the transition to a carbon neutral future was also sort of surprising. I mean, what is going on here? So as examples, I'm sure you know this, but humor me. 90% of Europe's solar panels come from one country. The same country also supplies 64% of Europe's wind turbines. If we look at the minerals in the supply chain that feed into Europe's industries, things become a little bit more interesting in a negative way. So think of the supply of processed polysilicon wafers, which are needed for solar panels. 97% of that comes from one country. The supply of cobalt, lithium, rare earth metals, and so on is just as concentrated as the supply of the polysilicon wafers. And another thing that I'd been seeing was, and we had been seeing, was the demographic concerns that Europe has, or Europe should have. I live in Germany, so that was not a surprise because it's a country with a large industrial sector, and it's particularly hard hit by demographic pressures. So we have currently 2 million jobs are open. 53% of German companies have job openings that they cannot fill. Europe-wide, according to the Commission, Europe is being hit by both an aging population due to a significant increase in life expectancy and low birth rates. So what this means is that the number of people aged 85 and above will increase from 12.5 million in 2019 to 27 million in 2050. And the number of centenarians, so 100 years and above, is estimated to increase from 96,000 in 2019 to 500,000 by 2050. And as this trend progresses, the number of people of working age will trend downwards. So the working population, so there will be 95 million fewer people of working age living in Europe by 2050. So there are fewer people living in the EU than in 2015 by 2050. And the working population will be expected to support the whole society, which is, of course, impossible, right? And it is hard to imagine how these challenges can be resolved without migration. Yet, somewhat perplexingly, Europe, the region with the biggest need for people, has made fighting migration from its neighboring continent with a very high youth population its main foreign policy objective towards that continent. So these are just some of the fundamental vulnerabilities I see when looking at Europe from an African perspective, and at Europe with Africa's own vulnerabilities in sight. And here I'm going to get to the point. So these vulnerabilities that both continents have also present unique policy innovation opportunities, right? So on the African side, African countries want to industrialize based on the raw materials that they have, and they want to avoid making mistakes of the past. So whereby commodities leave, get processed somewhere, values added, and then comes back as finished products to be sold to Africans. For Europe, Europe needs to reduce dependency on just one supply of processed raw material, needs to diversify the supply chain of intermediate products that feed into European industries. One could almost say that is a match made in the current geopolitical landscape heaven. So at APRI, we are working to come up with concrete policy options, for both sides in this. So for example, because we took seriously what we see as the current pain points of Europe around raw materials, and we're wondering how Africa can support in this regard while also, meeting its own policy objectives. So our response has been to put together a team of African researchers and scholars to work on key policies and initiatives that can support select African countries to achieve the policy objectives of their governments around value addition and industrialization. So this team of researchers are working on topics such as how to create a polysilicon wafer supply chain on the continent, how to have an effective battery chain, value chain on the continent, how Zimbabwe, for example, can leverage its lithium deposits for job creation, how the DRC, Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Zambia can actually implement their plans to have a common battery industry, and so on. There are about 10 of them. So what we're hoping to do is to bring these insights from these studies into discussions with external actors. But lucky for Europe, we're here, so they get to be one of the first that we talk to about this. And I'm talking about, directorates responsible for the European firms, making sure that they're healthy, DG Grow, and other relevant directorates and agencies. So on migration, that's a little bit difficult. We refused to work on this for a while, and we still haven't worked on it, because working on African migration in Europe means trying to help Europe stop Africans from coming, mainly. But we're beginning to rethink that blanket sort of decision of not doing it at all, because we're beginning to see an active process of recruiting tech talents, just as an example, from the African continent. And we're seeing that this is often to the detriment of African firms that need these talents on the ground. And many of them are coming to Europe, but they don't talk about it. Again, because we're in Europe and are actively observing the European domestic policy landscape, we are now thinking that we may engage on the topic, but in a very sort of clear way of what we're trying to achieve if we touch that at all. Of course, we're not going to try to stop tech workers from coming, but we need to sort of come up with policy ideas of what can actually be done so that both sides get something out of this. I am keenly aware that these are issues that I see because I look at Europe from an African perspective, from an African vulnerabilities perspective as well. But I can't help but wonder what issues and policy innovation opportunities someone looking at Europe from a Latin American perspective would see, a South Asian perspective, and so on, right? Looking at things from what concerns them in their countries, in their regions, looking at things from what concerns them geopolitically, and what policy, what pain points they have in their own countries as well. And so this is leading me to what I think of as a sort of call to action. APRI is unique in the sense that we have intentionally baked into the whole thing a European and African perspective, right? And so one of our objectives, like I said earlier, is to help policymakers sort of see things from the other side as well. So to put it bluntly, we are sort of able to provide what I hope they think of as honest and concrete views on what strategic partnerships between Germany and the EU on one side and African actors on the other side could look like. But this is what I would like to see. I would like to see Africa programs within European think tanks that are led by Africans, African experts and scholars. The US is a bit ahead on this. We can talk about that later. Or Latin American programs in European think tanks led by people from the region, right? So the goal would be that they're providing analysis not only of their own countries and of their own regions to European policymakers, but also looking at Europe with the lens of their own region, right? With the gaze of their own regions, analyzing European foreign and domestic policies to come up with policy options, right? And the other way around as well, I want to see Europe and US American programs within African think tanks, analyzing developments in Europe and offering policy recommendations to their governments based on this analysis, but also publishing this analysis, for European think tanks to consume. I'm almost finished. So zooming out, I can't help but wonder what these partnerships could look like. I mean, partnerships that take into full account both gazes, not just one. Because too often, scholars and think tankers from the global south are called to explain themselves and their regions and their countries in the global north, right? With almost no desire by northerners to listen to what southerners have to say about them. So think tanks and policymakers are guilty of this, and I mean on both sides, okay? Of course, there are reasons for this, which I won't go into here because I'm being told to stop. But this needs to change if we are really to move forward with working together in this geopolitical climate. I think that the uncertainties the world faces at this moment, we heard yesterday the uncertainties that global south people are very much used to dealing with. They require new partnerships, right, with clear views, clear gazes, clear ideas. And we think tankers, I think, have the responsibility to provide policymakers with honest analysis based on this. So in our little think tank, APRI, we are aiming to do so by showing what becomes possible when Europe starts to envision a partnership with Africa that goes beyond the notion of helping Africa, which is a policy narrative that plagues Europe's foreign policy towards the continent and that curtails Europe's own possibilities. So it is this potential of think tanks to connect the dots and speak with a voice that is capable of defying boxes imposed by geopolitical meddling and power that excites me about the work we're doing. It is also what makes me invite you to form new connections, new partnerships, take on new gazes, and break from our set scripts and narratives. The current global uncertainties, the polycrisis, and shifting geopolitical landscape demands this of us. Thank you.